All right, what this lesson is going to be about is how you could create a custom risk profile and then do some interesting things with derived property specifications in order to do a little bit of math in a table where you'd be tracking some of these risk items. So the goal that you have in doing this is to create something. This is only part of a table, but you would end up with something that looks similar to this, where you have some different types of risks, such as maybe a cost risk, a technical risk, a schedule risk, and then likelihoods of those risks. And then towards the end of this, you'll see how you can actually implement some operations that will do some math for you in these tables instead of using parametrics. That way, anytime you apply a stereotype of something, apply a stereotype to something, and it says risk, you'll have all these fields available, and all this math will actually calculate by itself. You don't have to add any new things to a parametric. You simply just have it in a generic table, and then you can go ahead and track those items based on whatever fields you need to. So without further ado, what you would start with in your model is a model element. I'm just going to rename this something, we'll call this a risk model. And that will be our highest level package. So in this highest level package that you have, or wherever you deem appropriate, you would want to create an element. And you're looking for a profile element. So once you've created that profile element, I would recommend calling that stereotypes or something along that line. And then inside of that profile, what you'll do is create a diagram. And you'll create a profile diagram. So now that you have your profile diagram, you would like to drag out a stereotype, and we will call this risk. So now anytime we apply this risk stereotype to a block or a requirement or any type of element in your model, it will have that name applied to it, but we'd also like to add a few fields to go along with that. And then you can track that in the tags section of the specification windows. So what we'll do is use the Smart Manipulator option here to create a property. And let's say we had a property of something like risk ID, and then a few more, maybe risk name, and then we'll say mitigations, and then we'll jump directly into the consequences of those, and that'll be really the meat of this will be how we can use those items to actually calculate some things in our table for us. So we'll go ahead and name one of them cost consequence. Another one will be the technical consequence. And then the schedule consequence. And then we'll have a likelihood of these occurring. And if you noticed on that PowerPoint presentation that I brought up on the screen a minute ago, we had a combined score. And that is not a field we are going to add to the stereotype. That is actually a field that we are going to add in the derived property specification, and we'll get to that towards the end. So the next thing you want to do is type these. So a risk ID, you may think you want to type it as a number, but we'll go ahead and use a string. That way, in case it does have some alphanumeric characters, it will allow those. And you want to use the value property string. And then for the risk name, that would most likely be a string. And for mitigations, we would use a string as well. And then for the cost consequence, I'm going to type that as an integer. That way it'll be a whole number. But you may want to use something like a real number in case it had decimal points. And notice I'm not using the primitive type of these, I'm using the value type. Schedule consequence will also be an integer. And then the likelihood will be an integer as well. Alright, so now we have that stereotype and it has a few fields. So let's say we had a simple architecture. I'm just going to create a block diagram here. And let's say we had a block, and we'll just call this one the system block. Now what you can do is apply that stereotype of risk. So you just right click on any of the blocks, or it could be a requirement or something like that as well. And we'll go to stereotype and search for risk. Now when we apply that, it adds the stereotype in the GMA, and if you look into the specification window, it'll be in the tag section that you have all of these different fields. So you could create these values from the specification window in the tag section if you wanted to. And let's say we had a cost consequence of 4, and maybe just add a couple fields here. And let's say the risk ID is, I'm just making up an acronym here because a lot of times you'll use the program's acronym for the risk ID and then some number after that. So for the name, maybe we'll just go with, let's see, what would be something that you would want to track as a risk item. Let's say long lead or something like that. Okay, so now that we have just a few of those fields filled in, what we're going to do is show one thing is it doesn't automatically show up on here, and if you would like it to show up there, notice you don't even have the option for tags here, but if you went to the symbol properties, you could allow that to show up on here. So show tag values would allow that to display, but most likely you probably would not want to see that in there. If you showed it in the compartment, it would look like that, but we'll just say do not display, because what we'd really like to do is create a generic table where we'd actually track all of these items so we don't clutter up our architecture. So inside the model, I will create a diagram, and this will be a generic table. And then for the element type, we will use the block, but then also that stereotype. So let's start out with block. And then I'm going to search for the stereotype risk. And there it is right there. So when we say, also you'd probably want to include stereotypes in case you have some subtypes of things such as specific types of requirements or specific types of blocks, such as subsystem blocks or system blocks or domain blocks. So we'll say include subtypes. And obviously we don't have anything showing up yet because we have not scoped this. So for the scope, you could just drag in this package, and then you'll have your block that shows up here. But what I'd actually like to show you how to do is scope it with a smart package. And the reason why it might be helpful to do that is because if you had a whole lot of blocks in your model, you'd start to get a lot of things that you probably didn't want to show up in this table. So if that were the case, I'd recommend using a smart package. So the way to do that would be to create an element, create a smart package, and what we'll do is we'll just have it pull in anything that is a risk item. So we'll call this all risks, or all risk items. And then in the specification for that, we'll do a query that'll pull in anything that has that risk stereotype applied to it. So I just went all the way down to the bottom where it said query, and we'll use a find operation, and you want to make sure this is on expert mode here. And for type, we'll want to see blocks because that's what I have applied this to, but like say if you applied it to requirements or something like that, this is where you'd want to specify that. So I'll say block and include subtypes, and then for the properties, this is where where we'll look for that applied stereotype. So we'll go to applied, and then in this section, in this field over here, there's a little ellipsis that you can expand out, and this is where you'll search for that stereotype specifically. So the risk item there, we'll say OK. And now what you should have is a package that'll pull in anything that's stereotyped as a risk item. So what I'm going to do now is get rid of this entire model being the scope, and we'll just use that smart package. So I'm going to drag in the smart package as the scope, and it'll look the same as it did before now, but like I said, if you had a whole lot of things in your model, most likely you'd end up with some items in there that you didn't really want unless you used the smart package method of scoping this. So now what we need to do is actually add some of the other fields, right? We want to see all those other fields that we added to the stereotype as columns in this generic table. So let's go to columns, and we'll do select columns, and if we search for risk, we just see we have risk ID and risk name, but there should be a section that has all of our tags in it in here. And there we go. So the tags that are stereotyped as risk, we want to go ahead and display all of these. And then there you have all of your fields. This could be exported at any point in time. In case you wanted to do a report, you could do that by just exporting this table. Of course, you could always go through your model and generate a report as well. I'm not going to go into that facet of this right now, but what I would like to show you is that you can go in here and you can add these fields directly, or these values directly, in your generic table. So let's say the technical consequence was 5, the scheduled consequence was 2, likelihood was a 3. And what I'm going to do next is show you how you can do a little math in this generic table by going back to your stereotypes profile or your risk profile and adding a derived property specification, and we'll pull in a column that'll be called combined score. And what it's going to do is it's going to take the max, whichever one of these is the highest, and multiply that by the likelihood, and then we'll get our combined score. So it sounds easy enough because you can use a max operation very easily in a parametric diagram, but when you get into doing that inside of a generic table, it gets a little bit trickier. So without further ado, let's go back to the stereotypes risk profile. So what you'd want to do is add a customization here, and we'll name this risk. And then we'll drag the stereotype onto that customization. So that's step 1. But now what you want to do is go into the smart manipulator options for the customization and add a derived property specification. And we'll call this combined score. And now, one of the most important parts of this is typing this combined score. So in order to type that, we need to right click, and there's one other thing we need to change in this specification as well. So we'll go to the specification for the derived property. Notice I'm not going to the specification for the whole customization. I'm just right clicking on the derived property specification, going to its specification. And for the type, what you want to use here is the primitive type of real. So if we type in real, notice you have the value type real and the primitive type real. This one is based off of the UML meta model, and if you were to use the value type for the SysML meta model, currently that does not allow you to actually calculate this and get a real result in a generic table. So you need to use the primitive type of real in order to make this work. The other thing you should do is say that is derived is true. So that's fairly straightforward. Now what we're going to do, I'm going to go back into that specification. You didn't need to close that out. And we'll go to the expressions section. And this will take us to the structured expression portion that you can access through any generic table if you were adding a new column or anything like that. And what we're going to do is create an operation. So really, you could get rid of the simple navigation, meta chain, find, and all of these if you wanted to, because what we're going to do is start from scratch here. So we're going to create an operation, and the first thing we'll do is create a script. And we'll change the language to JavaScript. So remember I said you wanted to do something like max of all of those different items like tech consequence, and then cost consequence and schedule consequence, and then we'll multiply that by the likelihood. In a parametric diagram, that would actually work. However, because of the limitations that are currently in MagicDraw, that is not the approach you'd want to take to get this done. So what you'll do is we'll just name one of these parameters max consequence. And we're going to multiply the max consequence times the likelihood. So that's the entire script right there. But now what we need to do is actually tell the structured expression how to derive the max consequence and where to find that, and then also where to find the likelihood. So what we're going to do is create an operation. And we'll create a max operation. So that sounds simple enough, right? So if you search for max, nothing pops up. But if you uncheck apply filter, you have a max operation as a built-in math function. So you can just click OK on that. And now it's saying, all right, what is the input? Well, if you do a little bit of investigation on what the max is doing, it's actually looking for a collection. So what we need the input to be is not just a whole bunch of different parameters that you think might be meta chains. You actually need to first use a collection and then point it to each of these using a meta chain. So we'll start with the max. Its input will be a collection. So if you scroll down here a little bit, you notice you have that as an option. So we'll use collection. And you can add as many different items to your collection as you'd like. So for the collection, we have input collection, create operation. What we'll do, and you'll see this become a pattern here in a minute because we're going to do this 3 different times, one for the schedule, one for the cost, and one for the technical consequence. So what we're going to do is create a first operation. So anytime essentially that you want to return a number and you want to do some math with that in a generic table, you always want to use a first operation. So we'll create operation, we're going to do another operation. So this time we're going to search for a first operation. So now we have a max operation that has a collection and a first operation. And now what we're going to do is actually look for one of those consequences, such as the cost consequence, technical, or the schedule consequence. So we're going to do a meta chain for that. And it's pretty easy meta chain when you have a stereotype. You can click insert and your stereotype automatically pops up right there. And notice the context for this is this. And what that means is that's essentially the root of that meta chain. So anytime you have the context set as this, it's saying that the root of that meta chain is what this is all based off of. And that's where we're going to start, is that the root of that meta chain is the risk. And then we'll look for anything that could follow that. So let's start out with just saying the cost consequence. So I type in cost, and notice it has the parentheses of risk, so you know that's the one you're looking for. And that's it. So that's your entire meta chain for that stereotype. But now we're going to add the other two. So we'll go down here to this create operation and do another first operation. We'll say OK. And we'll do the same thing. We'll do another meta chain, insert, and we'll do schedule for this one. So schedule. And the same thing, it has a context of this. For the create operation next, we do another operation for model and do the first again. We say OK, and then we do a meta chain off of that. So we do cost and schedule. Now we'll do technical consequence. All right, so that's those 3. And the name of this was max1. So if you look back at your script here, it's pulling in these two different arguments. And notice I said notice it's just saying that the parameters for this are argument 1 currently. So right now it's saying that it thinks this is one of the parameters. We're going to change that in a little bit. And what you can do is actually change the name of this max operation, because you want that to match what your parameters are. It's essentially a variable, but your variable names or your parameter names have to match. So what we can do is go back to this max operation and rename it max consequence. So we'll go back to max, and the operation name currently is max1, but we'll call it max consequence. All right. And then what we can do is actually drag this on as a parameter. So what I'm doing again is taking this right here where that little wheel is and dragging that on to create parameter. Right now it says it's argument 2. And we need to rename this max consequence, because that is actually the parameter name that it will use for this script. So then for argument 1, we'll have the likelihood, and we'll probably end up just deleting this, and I may as well just do that now. So for argument 1 equals this, we'll just say remove that, and what we'll do is the next for the likelihood we'll just drag on as a new parameter. So max consequence, I'm going to minimize that. We'll do one more operation for this, and we'll use a first operation. So create operation from model. We'll say OK, and the input for this will be the meta chain that leads us to the likelihood. So we'll hit insert and search for likelihood, and that should be all we need there. So for this first operation, I'm going to give it the name of likelihood, and then we'll drag that up to create parameter again as part of that script, and then we'll just rename the parameter name likelihood again. So now what we see is we have a script that has two parameters. One is max consequence, and the other one is likelihood, and those names match what it's pulling in. So for what it's pulling in here, we have a collection of all of these other firsts, and then the last of these is the likelihood, and each of those should return a value. So that should be all we need to do there. So let's see, as long as I did not mess anything up with this. Okay. I think what it did is it duplicated when I drug those onto the others as new arguments. So what I'm going to do is actually delete these. So let's go back to this one and remove that, and then for the likelihood we'll remove that as well. So that should have cleaned that up, and now we'll just say OK and close that out. So now we can go back to our model or to our generic table, and we need to figure out how we can actually get that to show up here. But one very important thing to note is anytime you make changes in a customization, you have to save the project and close it out and reopen it for that actually to take effect. So that's what we'll do now. Let's go ahead and save. And how to custom risk profile, we'll close this out. And notice you don't have to close out the entire model or the entire MagicDraw. You can simply close out the project and then we'll reopen that. So let's say open project, and we'll reopen that. All right, so now we go back to the generic table, and we'd like to get that to show up over here. So now we can go to the columns section, and we'll go back to select columns again, and we should have the option for combined score. Check that as true, and there you go. So now you have combined score, and it's calculating those values. It's taking the highest of these three, multiplying that by the likelihood, and you end up with a combined score. So that is a great way you can do math inside of a generic table. And as I said, anytime you're trying to return a value, or you're doing a meta chain that actually has a value as the target, I would recommend using that first operation before you actually do the meta chain, because if you might pound your head up against the wall if you just try to do the meta chain and think it's going to return that value, and it's not, because you need to use that first operation. So let's say after this you want to add a legend, something that would actually return some different colors depending on what those scores were. So the way you could do that is go up here to the legend, and you can create a legend. So we'll give this a name, we'll call it Risk Legend. And for the legend items, that's where you'll actually name these different levels for what your colors will represent. So we'll go to legend items and then add. So for this one, I'm going to do a low risk. And for the adornment, that's where you go in and add a color. So let's say we'll go to the fill color. For low risk, we want to use green. Say OK there. Close that out. And then you scroll all the way down here where it says apply to, and we're going to end up using elements by condition as well as adorn properties. So elements by condition will be our less than a certain number, and then the adorn properties is where we'll actually designate it to only highlight this combined score value. Otherwise, it'll actually highlight the entire row, which you may be okay with, but I prefer to simply have one column highlighted instead of all the entire generic table. So we'll go to elements by condition first, and we'll get rid of this property test. And let's see. What we're looking for here is an operation where we'll use less than or equal to. So we go to operation from model, and we'll search for less than or equals. And what this does is it checks A, and we will say if this meta chain is less than this number. So A will be the meta chain, B will be the actual value. So we will go ahead and use another first operation before we do the meta chain. So do another operation from model inside that A parameter. We'll use first again, say OK. And for the input, we'll do a meta chain navigation, and we'll do the risk combined score. Search for risk, and then we'll look for combined score. And another very important thing is your element type needs to be set to that stereotype as well. So we'll search for risk here, highlight that. If you do not check that box, you will not get a result with this. So we're using the risk as the element type, less than or equals, but we need to actually set the value. So B is where you set the value, and we'll just use an integer here, and we'll say if it's less than 5, we'll say OK there. And then you go down to the adorn properties. We're getting an error here, so we'll see if this actually works. For adorn properties, what we'll look for is combined score, and say OK there, and close this out. And we're not getting any results, so let's go ahead and save this. And I'll try closing it out and reopening it, and if that doesn't work, what we'll try is actually setting we'll use a real number instead of an integer and see if that helps. So, still not getting anything there. So let's go back to our risk legend. Go back to low risk and we'll look down here. So less than or equals element by condition, check that out. Now the first operation should be returning combined score and then B. Okay, so let's see. I think what we need to do is change this to make sure that is a real number. So we'll reset that. Just click on reset and then we'll go to real and type 5 here. Say OK, close this out. And we're still not getting anything. So forgive me guys, after a little bit of thought in there, it was realized that our score is not below 5, so that is why we're not getting any green colors for that. So let's say we want to change some of these numbers around so that we would return a result that would be less than 5. Let's see what happens here. So there you go. Combined score is now 4, and then it highlights that in green. Thanks for watching, guys.